Thank you, Eric. Before we do the apologies, can we just do some introductions? I think this is Matthew's first meeting of the pension board since taking on the role as head of pensions in Gloucestershire. So, Matthew, I don't know if you want to introduce yourselves, and then you may all need introductions. I think we've also got observers today.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sean. And yeah, I'll do a couple of introductions myself to start with, because yeah, I've been in situ since November, which now feels like a long time ago on that side. But this is my first board meeting, so I'm really pleased, about that, in terms of that and delivery today. Just a bit of background. I'm hoping I did. Way back when, do a bit of a pen portrait, which I'm hoping was circulated through to everybody, so a bit of understanding. I've been involved in pensions all of my career, basically since the age of 18 years old. Latterly with the LGPS specifically for the last 15 years now. Worked within Cornwall, so I've gone through the administration function at Cornwall, pensions manager there, and then into the investment side and the investment manager at Cornwall. I then moved into Brunel, the pooling entity that was created by the Southwest Collaborative group of funds, and I was with Brunel for 3 years up until I took the opportunity to move back to the light rather than the dark side, back into LGPS strategic work, and delighted to have the opportunity to work with Gloucester moving forward and yourselves moving forward. So just a little bit of a quick potted history of myself on that side, and I'm hopeful we will all get to know each other a lot more in the future. What I'd like to do as well, Sean, is just introduce briefly, I won't get them to talk yet, but Daniel and Karen from Aon are on the call today. And basically what we've done with Aon, we've appointed Aon as to undertake a governance review. So they did observe and sit in and observe the committee meeting last Friday. They will talk to you later on, I think at the last agenda item on the agenda today, to talk to you about the governance review and how you can help shape the future governance structure of the pension fund and the interactions between the committee and the board and moving forward on that side. So yeah, we will make sure that that comes through, and that's the reason why they're there. So yeah, welcome to those guys, and I'm sure they'll introduce themselves later. So back to you, Sean. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Have you met all members of the board, or would you like an introduction to the members of the board as well?
I think introductions would be quite nice, if that's okay.
Okay. Well, you obviously know me, Sean, as chair of the board. I'll just go around in the order there on my screen. Paul, you're first on my screen.
Hi, Matthew. Paul Jones. My substantive role is Executive Director, Finance and Assets at Cheltenham Borough Council.
I think it's John next.
Hi, I'm John Toppin, the Head of Policy and Resources at Gloucester City Council.
Well, I've got two Johns, haven't I?
Sorry.
I'm not sure, getting a lot of interference. Is that? I didn't get here from the other John.
Yeah, John A, I think your audio seems to be cut in and out. I'm not sure if it might be worth dialing out and dialing back in again.
In the meantime, Michael.
Hi, Michael Hunt, staff representative from Gloucester City Council, Unison's branch treasurer.
Nigel.
Good afternoon, Matthew. Nigel Moore, cabinet member at Gloucestershire County Council for Environment and Planning.
And Annette.
Hi, I'm Annette Benson, financial controller at University of Gloucestershire.
John's trying to move to get into a better position. I'm assuming that means we've got no apologies, Andrea.
No, everybody is present and correct.
Thank you. People happy to move then on to the minutes of the last meeting. Have anybody got any concerns about accuracy or any first on the minutes? Do people want me to page them, or are they happy to shout out?
No comments in that
Chairman,
case.
Chairman, I've got a comment to make on page 6, which is the item 8, the Pension Fund Business Plan 2020. You'll see the note at the bottom there was an action for me.
Okay, yeah, I'll come back to comments.
Okay.
I think we're happy in terms of accuracy then. So, Andrea, I don't know how we sign them these days.
I'll just make a note of it for the public record that the board has approved the minutes of the meeting.
Okay, and if I go through them then for any matters arising or for further comment, if I do them page at a time, then was there anything on page 1 that people wanted to raise? Page 2, page 3. And page 4, did you say, Nigel?
Page 6, Chairman.
Page 6, okay. Anything on page 4? Page 5? Page 6?
Yes, Chairman, if I may, you saw the action at the bottom of that paragraph, really bringing you up to date, because there was discussion then about essentially investing in property as part of the COVID recovery. Just to let you all know that later this month, the Cabinet at GCC are going to be considering something called an infrastructure recovery strategy, which aims to recover monies from development sites benefiting from publicly funded infrastructure improvements, for example, such as the M5 Junction 10. And really what I'm suggesting, this is a more direct approach, which can be locally referenced. For example, one of the beneficiaries from the improvements to Junction 10 will be the cyber park, which, for example, Cheltenham Borough Council are promoting northwest of Cheltenham. So really just wanted to give you that update on really the recovery plan at the County Council.
Okay, thank you. And there's nothing on page 7, so that concludes the minutes. People happy to move on to the minutes of the Pension Fund Committee. I think the first set is the meeting on the 4th of December. So this is for anyone to raise any issues on the minutes of the committee, Pension Fund Committee. So again, if we just go through them using the page numbers from our board pack. So page 9 is the first page. Page 10. 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and then we've got the minutes of the 29th of January meeting. Page 18. And page 19. I think that, as Matthew said, the committee also met last Friday, but there are no minutes yet for that meeting. I think, Matthew, the key points from that meeting will be covered on today's agenda.
Absolutely, Sean. Yeah, the majority of what was taken to committee on Friday are also papers and will be discussed with the board today.
So I think if people are happy, then we can move on to agenda item 4, which is the annual report. Matthew, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sean. Just very quickly on this one. Might feel a little bit old hat now, and I think that's just kind of as a result of the scheduling of the local pensions board meetings with regard to that. But the pension fund annual report has been published. It was published in line with the with the statutory deadline of the 1st of December. It was published on the website. I didn't attach it, the 120 pages which make up the annual report on that side. It is on the website from that side. It is obviously the statutory document. I kind of refer to it as the Bible of the particular fund. It contains all of the statutory documentation of the fund and the financial statements for the year 2019-2020. In normal circumstances, a draft of that would have been circulated to committee and more than likely towards the board as well through that process before publication. I think COVID, as we know, got slightly in the way of a number of meetings during that early part of that time. The audit was finalised, and Grant Thornton did issue their audit findings, which were recorded that the financial statements were a true and fair value of the pension fund position on there. Just with the annual report, obviously the first few pages of the annual report is written and designed that as a bit of as an executive summary. So if board members were to only read the first 5 pages, it should give you a good feeling of the position of the fund for that particular year. But as we approach obviously another year and another close down, we'll be discussing next year's annual report before you know it on that side. So it was just really for committee to note that annual report, that statutory document, was actually published on schedule. Thank you, Sean.
Okay. On the assumption that we've all read the 120 pages, has anyone got any questions for Matthew? That looks like a no, Matthew. So people are happy to move on to item 5, which is an update, part 1.
Okay, again, thank you, Sean, for this. What the board have got here in front of you is a slightly different style design report, which I took to committee, which is updating the committee and the fund and yourselves around the performance on a number of areas of the fund to the quarter ending December. So these reports will be produced on a quarterly basis on that side and move through. So this was a report that was taken to committee on Friday. They noted the position. It's more of a backward looking document in terms of some of the activity. So I'll just kind of take you through some of those parts. The report starts on page 23, and the first part is really to note the investment performance of the fund. So the fund actually finds itself in a good position at the end of the quarter, at the end of December. Fund performance during that quarter has been good. The strategy has performed well. It's ahead of its benchmark. The fund actually increased by about £193 million. So what it finds itself in is in a position above where it was the pre-COVID crisis. So the drop in the market valuation that occurred through March and into April has now been recovered from that position on that side of things. There is appendices with more comprehensive data performance, and if you look back over the longer term, the 1 year, the return of 7.8, which is ahead of its benchmark, and its 3-year number at 5.9 is slightly behind the benchmark, but actually importantly, that 5.9% is actually ahead of the actuarial requirement in terms of what the actuary sets as part of its as part of their valuation process, which is at 4.8%. So actually the assets have been performing well during that period of time. And Appendix 1 at page 33 of your packs actually brings that together on that side of things. Appendix 2 on page 35 actually gives where the strategic asset allocation of the fund actually sits as at the end of December. We just reviewed some of the minutes in January where the committee made some decisions around the equity spread and actually responding to the COVID crisis and in terms of reviewing its equity allocation. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we look at the risk register on that side as well. What that doesn't reflect are those potential changes at that point in time, but it does highlight some of the areas where the fund has kind of moved outside of its target ranges, and we'll talk a little bit more about what the committee had decided and the actions that have been taken to rectify on that position. So that's the investment activity. There was also other activity. We just talked about property and UK and investment on that side. During the quarter to the end of December, there was the investment of £50 million into international property that was agreed by the committee, and that was committed to Brunel. And at the same point, an opportunity was taken to invest an additional £14 million into the UK property portfolio, just to bring that back to it in its target allocation on that side. On pages 25 and 26 of your report is something that we took to committee for the first time in terms of analysis and data. And this is actually statistics that are provided by Hermes EOS. Now, Hermes EOS are an organisation that they're appointed to on behalf of Brunel to enact Brunel's and our voting and engagement strategy policy. So obviously, you know, voting and engagement across the universe is a very time consuming and a very large operation. Hermes are a provider of those services that will enact, and they enact that for not just us, but multiple investors. So it's actually bringing the weight of those investors behind. So what this is actually showing committee was the amount of active engagement and voting that had actually taken place. So the voting relates to actually resolutions that were taken to AGMs where there was an official AGM. On pages 27 and 28, I think are the more important ones, is about engagement. So we talk about engagement, you know, with organisations, about being responsible asset owners and the fund actually taking its responsibility seriously. So we utilise Brunel and we utilise Hermes EOS to do that for us on our behalf, because we are obviously a very small committee and board after all. So what they do is actually engage within in respect of our policy that's based around the sustainable development goals of the United Nations in terms of those areas. So it was actually giving the committee and yourselves here a flavour of the amount of engagement that's actually being taken on your behalf as responsible asset owners. So as you can see, over the quarter to the end of December on the engagement, Hermes EOS on our behalf had engaged with 368 companies over a range of issues. That could have been around gender equality, could have been around climate action, could have been about decent work and economic growth, all linked to those sustainable development goals. And I think one of the things that we'll be doing with yourselves in committee moving forward is engaging a little bit more and providing more detail around that engagement plan and making sure you're fully aware of that moving forward. But I think it's one of those key statistics that we need to actually make sure that we're advocating in terms of that, so people are aware and the membership are aware of the responsibility and the active asset owners that is being placed at this point. Page 29 of the report brings an update of the funding position, and I know a number of employers will be looking at this with a bit of interest, that we do actually find ourselves in a very healthy funding position at this time. So the actuary has provided this information. The snapshot is that the fund on a rolled forward basis, so still based on the data and assumptions from the 2019 valuation, they roll all of that information and data forward on that side, and that on that basis the fund currently would find itself actually in a surplus position and funded to about 106% at this point in time. And we will talk a little bit about, you know, some of the things that we need to worry about moving forward around that funding position. But it is a good funding position. We do find ourselves coming up to another actuarial valuation next April in 2022. But obviously that's the position we find ourselves at this point on that side. And then finally on this report, there's a couple of things and a couple of issues that have arisen. The first one around the fund administration. So we are updating yourselves, the committee, around the performance of the administration function at this time. So actually on page 30 in table 1 to the period December, actually the administration team has been coping very well with the with the changes that COVID have brought to its working practices. The level of its performance in terms of meeting the targets and the turnaround target dates, which are set in the admin strategy, are strong when you compare to the actuals in 2019-2020. I think table 2 shows a slightly different story when you compare it to other tables. We have seen a slight reduction in the volume of some of that activity around estimates. On that side, retirements have held up fairly well, but I think estimates, and I think again that's kind of testament to the position that we find ourselves in. I think the number of employers that would have normally been looking at restructuring or reorganisation during this period, that hasn't actually come through, that it would have done at normal regular intervals, had we not been experiencing COVID. And I think as we come out the other side of that, I think, there's potential to see some kind of readjustment back and realignment back to the volume of those numbers moving forward. So, estimates as a comparison, are a little bit lower than they have been, but we are expecting that to pick up through the rest of this year and into next year. And then I think the last thing on this report, just really to bring to everyone's attention, and I'm sure you're all fully aware of the 95k cap. I suppose you could class them now as the hokey cokey regulations. They've been in and out. This is something that government have talked about for a number of years. What this was actually a restriction on the amount of a severance package that an employee could receive when they were to exit local authority or other public service pensions. In other words, to kind of stop those kind of Daily Mail big number headlines to come through. I think after about 3 or 4 years of being in consultation and waiting, we finally got the regulations. They came in, they applied from last November. I think they were then challenged on a number of fronts, and there was some intended judicial reviews that we were awaiting to actually take place. And prior to that, we then received, kind of out of the blue, a revocation from the government of those regulations, the exit cap regulations, and we were instructed to assume that they'd never actually applied. So at the moment, there is no cap that we would be applying in that situation. I think from an operational perspective on our team, I think the impact is minimal. I think we had very limited people that actually exited who were subject to the cap and our interpretation of the regulations. There were a number of quotations that were provided to employers that has meant that we've had to double up on that work. And I think the only thing I would say on those is that it hasn't gone away. I think we are expecting in the summer for those regulations to come back in some form or another once they've actually been reviewed again by central government. So I think the intention that we've had from government is that they do still intend to bring an exit cap payment or an exit cap payment to be applied to public service employees. But again, we now await that regulation and we'll have to adapt and apply that when we get to that point. So hopefully that kind of gives you a bit of a flavour of where the fund is as at the end of December, and I'll hand back and answer any questions, Sean. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. I think the role of this board is to scrutinise the work of the Pension Fund Committee, make sure it is working efficiently, effectively, and in compliance with the regulations. So I suppose this report is one of the key mechanisms for the committee to assess whether it's doing that. So I think this is an opportunity for us to look at that report and say, are they looking at the right things? Where the information is telling them something that doesn't look right, are they making the right actions, taking the right actions? And are they on top of it? Or are there issues that we would want to raise any concerns about? So I think that's our role as a board. So I think in that context, we go through the report and probably take section by section, just to be clear what the committee are looking at, and are they looking at the right things, and are there actions that the committee should be taking that we want to check up on or query. So I think the first section was the investment performance section, Matthew. So do any member of the board have issues or comments they want to raise around the investment performance and the information presented to the committee? I can't work out if there's a hand system on this, Andrew, or people just wave at me to.
There is a hand function, but I am sort of looking at everybody on the screen and nobody at this moment in time is indicating to talk.
Which I take then means either people are very happy with the information they presented, which I hope is the answer, or they haven't fully understood what they're seeing in front of them, which may mean that I presume, Matthew, this is a report which will go to committee regularly and therefore will come to board regularly.
Yes, it will be. Yeah.
So I think if that's the case, then I think in future meetings, this is something we can be looking at and looking at trends and what's actually in this report, so we can actually scrutinise the work of the committee. I think the second section was on the engagement, I think, wasn't it, Matthew, voting and engagement?
Yes.
So again, are there any issues that board members want to raise on the section on voting and engagement? I can see, Paul, you put your hand up.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, it's, Matthew and the team have obviously put a lot of work into this, and I think obviously to give it credibility, we do need to make some comments, even if it's to applaud the team. And I mean, I guess in terms of the first section, obviously from my perspective as a member of the fund, I'm really pleased to see that, one, it's above 100% funding, and two, that it's obviously back to pre-COVID levels, or indeed it's actually exceeded pre-COVID levels. And I think obviously everybody involved in that should be applauded in terms of achieving that outcome in extremely difficult circumstances. And I'm sure many on this committee, like myself, wasn't expecting it to recover as quickly as it has, and with the roadmap in terms of the vaccinations, and hopefully by the 21st of June, that will recover further, and I guess some of that sort of instability, as you've mentioned, like Brexit and the US presidential elections, have come to pass. In terms of the next section, which I've obviously put my hand up, I wonder, Matthew, if you could just give a bit more clarity, because I must admit, in terms of the graphs that I'm looking at, they're quite fuzzy, and I'm assuming that Hermes are going to various committees and voting on our behalf, and from what I can sort of see, there's lots of fors and there's lots against, but I guess from my own understanding, I wasn't quite clear. I don't know whether you could just elaborate a little bit more in terms of what these voting meetings they're going to, and how it affects us, just to give me a bit more understanding. I don't know whether other members are in that place. Maybe I'm alone here, but I would like a bit more clarity so that I can at least then ask the right questions.
I think, thank you, Paul, for that one. And actually, this is something that was discussed a little bit more at committee as well, about actually understanding the drivers behind this. So I think that what we will be taking away is, when we talk a little bit later on about the training and everything else, is actually applying that to both yourselves at the board and committee level to actually understand this information. Yeah, the voting statistics predominantly are when listed companies are holding their official annual general meetings or their AGMs. So this is where they're potentially voting. So there's normally a number of resolutions which are then applied by the board, or in some cases shareholders will actually be able to apply resolutions for voting at those annual general meetings. I think the discussion which took place at the board was actually about where there was votes for and against, and it was, and it was highlighted about, predominantly where the votes seem to be against, and apologies that it is a little bit fuzzy. It was a cut and paste from a report that we got from Hermes on that one. Was around things like board structure and remuneration seem to be the standard voting, and what that actually in terms of lies is in terms of the engagement and the policy that Brunel and others have around kind of what they classify as good corporate governance. So good corporate governance would normally see a kind of a refresh of members of the board on an ongoing basis, rather than somebody holding a board position for 10 or 15 or 20 years. So sometimes they would have been voting against kind of the reappointment of a board member on that particular basis. Now, normally those votes still then go through, but it's actually about us actually trying to apply what we would conceive to be good governance around that, and that's what Hermes are actually doing when they're going to those board meetings. And especially, I think we're well known within the press about the executive remuneration, and normally the way that those balances work. So that's normally where those votes are surrounded in terms of those amendments. But we have had instances where Brunel on our behalf, as part of Gloucester, have also then taken shareholder resolutions to committee or to boards, things like Barclays, for instance. That was one that that was publicised quite widely around, you know, their engagement around carbon and other aspects of that have actually made through. So it's to try and give an idea of a snapshot. I think what we do need to do is take that away and actually make sure that we're developing an understanding with both the board and committee about what that engagement plan is as well. So when you're looking at these statistics, you can reference that back to the engagement plan. And I think that's something that I took away from committee last week that we need to do to make sure that when you're getting this information, or when the committee are getting this information, it actually then it then works around what they're actually getting on that side. And I think the engagement is sorry, the engagement is slightly different because that's not the official annual general meeting. This will actually be Hermes sitting with senior members of the organisation within the company outside of those resolutions and actually engaging with them and trying to influence the way that the business is operating on a number of different levels. So, you know, that again is something through that engagement plan, which is very important, especially when we then talk around this kind of engagement divestment argument that you know happens within the industry.
I suppose the question for me, Matthew, is how does the committee assess whether that engagement is effective? What I can see in the report is factual. It tells us when they've engaged and on what subjects and what they voted on. I'm not sure it tells me anything about the outcomes, and it's just on like business priorities, and is that engagement effective?
Yeah, it's a very, very good point, Sean, because I suppose that's one of the things that's maybe a little bit more difficult to actually record or actually evidence. How effective has that engagement been? And that's something that we're looking to try and develop with Brunel. So we'll look at a little bit of, you know, and within the papers later on, there's some areas where, you know, we've identified some activity that we're wanting Brunel to do on behalf of the partnership as a whole. And one of those is around reporting. And one of those specifically around reporting is how do we report some of our outcomes around responsible investment, around engagement? How do you quantify that? How do you challenge that? So it is a challenge that we've got, and it is something that we will be looking to develop alongside all of the funds and with Brunel, so we can actually tangibly assess how that works. So I think that's really is an area that we'll be looking to develop.
Yeah, I should have said when I asked that question, we haven't got it right in Oxfordshire yet, so I was challenging you from a position of weakness there. Any other questions on the voting and engagement section? Can't see any. So the next section, I know Paul's already commented on, was the actually funding update. Anybody else got any comments on the funding update? Okay, if that's, then it's the fund administration and the performance statistics for the fund administration. Has anybody got any comments or issues they want to raise on that? Paul, I can see your hand up again.
Again, I just wanted to thank Matthew and his team, because whilst some of those statistics may not have achieved the target, what is clearly evident, specifically in respect of what I see as important in terms of retirement and lump sums and death grants, is a huge year-on-year improvement, and I think that should be acknowledged.
Thank you. I'll pass that back on to Alan and the team.
Are there any other issues that people want to raise on these statistics? So, Nigel?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. It's really more about whether Matthew has considered just how long the particular administrative arrangements are going to last for in the way that you split up the teams. Do you see that really going for the remainder of this year, or is that very difficult for you to even begin to think about?
Yeah, I think we are working on the premise that we're here, especially for this year, is maybe more in for the long haul in terms of working remotely. I don't know if the board are aware of how the administrative side of the team is working. So the team is split into two. Half of them come into the office and work socially distanced within Shire Hall for a week. The other half are at home, and then they switch round. So, you know, there is an element that that's the way that we're operating. I think one of our key areas of focus will be is ensuring that we've got the right processes, software in situ to allow for as greater flexibility moving forward as possible. So I think Gloucestershire County Council are already starting to employ agile working, I think is the phrase that we're utilising. I think others look at it as flexible working. Some people refer to it as hot desking. So in other words, I think the future capacity of Shire Hall will be that there's not a singular desk per person scenario. So I think the flexibility of working moving forward will always be with us now, regardless of that. And I think it will be our responsibility to make sure that the people have got the right tools and the right ability to work as effectively as possible within the situation that we're working. From the accounting and the investment team side, it's a little bit easier for that team to work from a remote environment, and I know a number of them are enjoying not having to have the commute in and out of the office. But you know, I still think that for the foreseeable, up until step 4 in June, but then I still see that going beyond, and I will advocate that I would hope that to give the team the flexibility to work to the best for them in terms of their work-life balance moving forward. But one of the challenges will be for me is to make sure that we're making it as efficient for them as possible and give them the right tools to actually achieve that.
Any other questions on the admin section? And I think the final section, the 95k cap, as Matthew said, that's been in and out, so I'm not sure if there are any questions on that.
I was more for awareness, if there was anything that it will come back to us.
And I suppose then my last question would be, are there any areas that the board would like to see performance information on, or would like the committee to be seeing performance information on? You know, are there areas that, you know, we're looking at there and saying, I don't know how the committee's doing on something because it's not recorded any of those stats? Are there gaps in the data? Can't see any hands up, so I'm assuming therefore, Matthew, that as far as we're aware, that the committee are looking at the right things and are taking the right sorts of actions in terms of ensuring performance is of the standard required and in accordance with the regulations. Okay, people happy to move on to the risk register? Because we just asked to note that report. Okay, Matthew, risk register.
Okay, risk register, thank you. So obviously I'm aware that the risk register goes to committee every quarterly meeting, so they've seen a number of iterated changes to the risk register that you may not have seen during that time. So what you have in front of you is the last risk register that was looked at. I think since your last meeting, I think predominantly there's been a number of increases and decreases in terms of some of those risks. Some of them have gone up and down again during that time. So I'll just I'll walk through those. And I think the ones really to look at that were heightened and increased at some point in respect of the output of and the initial part of the COVID pandemic was risk F1, F2 and F4, which resulted around the expected return and the investment strategy and also the funding level. So they were heightened at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, and there was a number of mitigations that have been undertaken to review those risks and make sure that we're mitigating them as much as possible. So in September, we increased risks F1 and F2 up, and then committee agreed to undertake an equity review. So reviewing the mix of the equities, was the expectation now from the markets of those particular equities the same as what we based the original strategy on, bearing in mind that the world is now a slightly different environment. So that review was that review was undertaken, and that was taken back to committee in January, which then did bring in a couple of changes in terms of the equity mix. But predominantly, it was that actually markets aren't really that affected by, you know, the COVID, or the longer term outlook isn't you know, hugely affected in terms of what we're expecting from the investment strategy moving forward. So those risks went up and back down, and obviously F4, the funding position, because we find ourselves back at our pre-COVID levels again, that risk has been altered from that side. I think some of the risks that remain increased, which was another ask that went to committee in December, was around the resourcing and the staffing of the team to actually make sure that we're providing the levels of service. And we looked at the statistics earlier on in terms of the administrative service, especially to actually allow for agile working moving forward, to allow for the changes that are coming through the 95k cap McLeod and the increasing complexity and the increasing levels of that side. So the risks around resourcing were increased. They do remain increased at the moment. We have an agreement for committee now for increased resourcing for the team moving forward. The only reason they remain heightened is that we're now into that dreaded recruitment period where things, you know, will take a little bit of time to go out to advert, appoint, and then for people to actually come through to those roles. But we do see that moving down. And again, now what we will be doing on an ongoing basis as part of the business plan every year is reviewing the staffing level to ensure that we've got the right levels of staffing to ensure that we can deliver the services that are required from that side. And then I think latterly that the last increase that has been put through on the risk register this time was around risk F6. Which was around the inflation, and the committee agreed on Friday for ourselves to take a review of the investment strategy to look at how we can mitigate the potential impact of inflation, of an inflationary environment that we might find ourselves in, because that could have an impact on the funding level. The benefits and the liabilities are inherently linked to inflation. The benefits of people's pensions rise up with inflation, so it will affect that kind of the liability value. And what can we do to mitigate that and have some risk management within the portfolio to allow for those things moving forward? So the risk register is being utilised as a live document to manoeuvre things through. The risks that have been increased so far, have been reflected, and the committee have reviewed those. And I suppose I'll kind of open it up to any questions or any comments that the board has on any of the risks, because I think this is one of the most important documents that we have as a fund to work through.
I saw Paul, your hand first, and then Nigel.
Thank you, Sean. And again, thank you, Matthew. I look through the risks and I tend to focus on those that are potentially going up. So I'm glad that you made reference to risk F6. I guess my question is that obviously the risk is labelled as pay and price inflation, and whilst I totally endorse everything you've said and the commentary there in terms of CPI increases, I guess my challenge or question is whether pay constraint, which is obviously in the news specifically over the weekend when we hear about the NHS, the 1%, and I guess more akin to the local government pension scheme, where we're probably looking at pay constraints of somewhere between 0 and 1%, whether that would have a counterbalancing effect.
Yes, it does in some way, but obviously now we're into a career average. The CPI, your previous year's pot will increase in line with CPI. So in that inflationary environment, it just means that obviously with the pay restraint that we have on that, it does actually, yes, it will mitigate it to a certain degree, because obviously the next year's pot won't be as, if you'd have had a pay rise, you would have had a slightly higher pot. So the CPI is more of a driver than it is the pay. Obviously, we're still waiting some of the impact of McLeod, so that pay restraint might have an issue when you're looking backwards at the McLeod issue that might still link a little bit more of your service to your final salary. So there is some pay restraint within that as well. So yes, it is a mitigator, but I think that CPI is potentially more of a driver than the mitigation on pay at this moment in time.
Nigel.
Thank you, Sean. I think for those new to the board, this has been a real success for the board because, as Sean and I both know from several years ago, we were of the view that this wasn't the live document, which it is now, as Matthew has said, and that's very much my own take on this. This is much more of a live document than it was several years ago. And I know from my attendance at the committee meetings, a great deal of time is spent on it now. Just a thought though, because we only see this once or at best twice a year. And I just wonder whether it would be sensible to share with the board just the risk register on a more regular basis, Matthew, so that we just have that opportunity, several times a year rather than perhaps only once a year at the moment, just to have a look at the risk register and see just how live it is. I'm content with it now, but it's just, going forward, it's just a thought I might like to consider.
Yeah, absolutely. No problem with that at all. We'll make sure it gets shared with you more on a regular basis if we're not meeting on a more regular basis.
I think that issue is going to come up later on in the agenda as well, Nigel. The whole issue about frequency of meetings of the board and are we meeting frequently enough to do our job? And I think from what you're saying is that you've got concern that we as a board can't do our job effectively if we're only meeting twice a year in relation to the risk register specifically.
I think that's right, Chairman, because we're living in a very volatile world, and that's part of our function, is that governance function, and to do that we really need to be as well informed as possible.
Okay. Yes, so I think we will pick that up again later on in the agenda. Any other issues on the risk register? Can't see any more hands. I think again we're asked to note the report, and I think there's some specific issues that we were asked to note at the bottom of the report, set out in 3 bullet points. Are people happy to note it? I can't see any objections, and yeah, I think that's duly noted. I think item 7 then is the regulatory statements. Matthew again.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. Yeah, so what we have here are two. Obviously, as you know, in that annual report, the 120 pages, there's a number of statutory statements that apply to the fund. The funding strategy statement and the investment strategy statements are two of the key. One, the funding, about how we're going to fund those liabilities, the actuarial assumptions that the actuary puts on. Predominantly, this is reviewed in line with the valuation process, and at points during the year or during the intervening years, it might be updated for specific things or slight amendments. If it's a very minor thing, will go through consultation. It can just be incorporated in on the actuary side. The funding strategy statement that you've got in front of you has been revised and predominantly to introduce the main employer discretions that have just been launched by government, and specifically around something called deferred debt arrangement, which hopefully gives the employers better flexibility to operate with the fund, and actually also has better protection for the fund moving forward as well. So actually reacting to a situation. So the first one really with the deferred debt arrangement is that once an admitted body or an employer has no active members left, it kind of then triggers a cessation, or it crystallizes the position of that particular body at that time. And it might be that an employer does want to leave the fund, but they can't materially afford it because of the funding position or the exit payment that's in it. And the regulations before would have been that at that point, you would have crystallized it, and then you would need to, that money would need to either be paid to the fund, or a very short-term arrangement would need to be put in place. what the deferred debt arrangement allows is that for an employer now to have no active employees, but to actually maintain their membership of the fund, pay the secondary contribution or the deficit payments until such a point where the fund and the employer would look at the funding position on an ongoing basis as part of the valuation, and then it would be a more controlled exit from their position once there was a comfort that the liabilities were actually covered in full. So it wasn't potentially forcing employers to go under on that side. So hopefully some really good flexibilities for the way that the fund can operate moving forward. As it was quite a major change, it has gone out to consultation to the employers during that period of time. We didn't receive any comments back from that. I have had one comment today, and there is one omission of Cheltenham Borough Council from the list, so they will be added back in before it gets published as a final document. I think that's hopefully a minor change in terms of the list of those that will operate for stabilisation. So I'm sure, Paul, thank you very much for highlighting the, that oversight this morning. But it is one of those key documents that are coming through. Now, in normal circumstances, and this goes back to Sean's point before, is that as part of that consultation, we would also consult with the board in draft format of that funding strategy statement. What we were trying to do was actually escalate things because of the committee cycle, and we're coming to the end of the committee, to actually get that, in a position with the committee that the employers can now benefit from those employer discretions moving forward on that side. But in theory, the consultation process should involve the board because it is one of those key statements. And it might well be that the board wish to review that funding strategy statement in the future, in the not too distant future, to ensure that it is formally compliant. And I know that when we talk about the governance review later on, this is something that Daniel and Karen will be actually looking at for us as well. And that's similar with the investment strategy statement as well. So the changes to the investment strategy statement that you have here, again, the other strategy document, are reflective of the decisions that were taken by committee in January. So it is just updating predominantly the equity strategy that's contained within the investment strategy statement itself. So it's a reflective of a document of actually what the strategy of the fund is. And again, that one was actually taken through at that point. So Sean, I'll hand back to you, and if there's any questions on that side.
Are there any questions from board members?
I will say that both of these documents were approved on Friday, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, Paul has a question.
Yeah.
He just raised his hand.
Thank you. Well, firstly, thank you, Matthew. I'm glad that that oversight will be reflected. I did see the document previously, and I never picked it up, so that's a worrying perspective from me. I guess all I wanted to say is I'm really pleased to see the suggested amendments in terms of those exit payments or that deferred debt, because I think we're now in a culture with having had 10 years of austerity, and who knows what's going to be on the horizon, where obviously a number of us setting up alternative delivery vehicles, which ultimately does sort of end up in a closed scheme with the LGPS, and I could see a number of those in the future, some closer to me than others that could potentially end up in that situation. And I think this is a great way for those employers to be able to manage their exit without effectively becoming insolvent.
Thank you, Paul. Any other questions or comments? Again, I can't see any. But I think, as Matthew said, I think the issue for me is it would have been useful if the board had an opportunity to review these documents during the consultation process, which I think comes back to your point, Nigel, about the frequency of meetings. The fact we last met in October, this came out and went to consultation and has been agreed by committee in that intervening 6-month period, means we couldn't effectively scrutinise either of these two key documents for the scheme. So I think it is an issue that I think we need to come back to again. People happy to move on? Item 8 then is the training strategy.
Okay, thank you, Sean. So yeah, the training strategy. Now this is something I'm looking for the board to endorse in terms of the training strategy. So my current report is on 127, starts on 127 of your packs through to 129 on your packs. This training strategy was again taken to committee on Friday, and committee did approve it as it stands from there. What this actually does is again good governance and good practice to have a strategy of how we are going to deliver the SIP for knowledge and skills requirements. As we know, there are slightly different requirements on a pensions committee and also a slightly different set of knowledge and skills framework for pensions board members as well. And the training strategy incorporates both of those as well as officers as well, because it's not just pensions board and pensions committee that need to be aware and keep their knowledge and skills relevant to undertake their to take their responsibilities. It's also down to the officers as well. So the document itself actually covers all aspects of that. We instructed Hymans to come in and work with us to produce us the training strategy. It was obviously felt very timely because we are about to go into an election period, which might mean that we end up with new members of the pensions committee. And I'm aware, obviously, there's certainly some newer members of the pensions board as well that will obviously hopefully benefit from the way that we will look at the delivery of training in the longer term with regard to this. In the business plan, we highlighted a high-level training plan, but what will happen is that upon approval and endorsement of the training strategy, we will undertake and with Hymans a training needs analysis that will then help us effectively bring a plan together. But what we will always be attempting to do is make sure that the training that is being delivered and the training is appropriate and is timely within that and is not too onerous. So there's a number of different ways that training can be delivered. It might be through webinars, it may be online through the toolkits. It might well be at the beginning of a board meeting that we're holding a 30-minute or 40-minute training session before the meeting. And similarly with the same way that will operate at committee as well. And what we would hope to do is deliver training in a way that covers both and everybody comes together to receive that training and build up that knowledge and skills. The elements of training that we will devise will be linked to the knowledge and skills framework, and what we will be able to do is document how we're delivering it, why we're delivering it, and on what benefit that it will then actually achieve against that knowledge and skills. And what it will also do is that we will refresh this on an annual basis in terms of the needs analysis to make sure that we're keeping it relevant and current as we actually move forward from that side. So I think what this does also mean is that, you know, and I'm sure others and Sean will be aware of this as well, is that there is the good governance review that is going on with the Scheme Advisory Board at this moment in time. And one of the major drivers around that is actually around the knowledge and the skills and the training and the relevant experiences that people actually have to deliver those views. So this does work very much in line with the requirements of looking at that good governance project that's ongoing at the moment and what we're expecting to be those outcomes from there as well. So again, you know, I kind of commend the training strategy to you as is for endorsement and adoption by yourselves as board members moving forward. So I'll hand back to you, Sean.
Thank you, Matthew. Questions for Matthew on the training strategy? Thank you, Paul.
Okay, again, Matthew, I completely endorse what's in here, and I reflect on my own personal journey. I think probably six years ago, pensions was just something that the county told me about once every 3 years in terms of this is the numbers you've got to pay. And I guess it's only really in that sort of period that it started making me reflect on some of the previous decisions I'd made in terms of alternative delivery models and indeed maybe outsourcing. And it became quite apparent to me on a number of sort of conferences that I've attended and roundtable that at district level, certainly there is a very minor understanding of pensions, and given that it makes up probably one of the biggest numbers in their budget when you add the primary and secondary contributions together, to not be able to challenge the actuary when they're dishing out the results every 3 years is quite frightening. And I'd like to personally put on record that certainly the last actual revaluation, there was huge interaction between the 151 officers at district level and the county, and indeed Hymans, which resulted, certainly from my perspective, in a very positive result. So I fully endorse everything you're saying there. There needs to be a much broader understanding of what we're signing up to, and that sort of overbearing strategy about whether we're recovering the deficit over 25, 20, 17, 14 years and all those sort of conversations. So I'm really pleased that that's captured within this, and I look forward, subject to diaries, etc., obviously embarking on my own personal development. Thank you.
I can't see any more hands up. Oh, sorry, Nigel, yes?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Matthew, have you given any thought to just what the time requirements are likely to be for members of the board? I think that's something that we'll all like to know, or get some guidance, particularly in the view of what the Chairman's already said, if we're going to be meeting on a more regular basis too.
Yeah, very much so. So thank you, Nigel, for that. I think what I was trying to say earlier is that we are very conscious that everybody is very busy, and there are pressures on people's commitments and commitment time. So what we need to do is make sure that we're delivering the training via multiple different routes that works for the right individual. So it's not going to be a one size fits all, because it might not be appropriate that that's the way that people will learn to train. So as part of the needs analysis, it will also identify how do you want to receive some of that training. So it might well be webinars. What the traditional way, a lot of the time, is for is training to take place at the beginning of a meeting. So, so for the first half an hour of a board meeting, it would be dedicated to training, and then we would move into the meeting. So you would normally train around on topics that might be contained within the agenda, or certainly some areas where you're looking to actually have that focus. Now, hopefully what we'll be able to do is we'll also be doing a very similar thing with the Pensions Committee as well. So it might be that at the beginning of a board meeting that Pensions Committee members will be joining yourselves as well to receive that training, and then they will then move away as you move into your meeting, and vice versa. There's certainly training days that Brunel operates. There are things that, there are conferences, and it will change. But what we will also try and do is, where appropriate, use the technology which we're all now a little bit more versed with in terms of webinars online, as it comes through. We would hope not to make it too onerous. It's not, it's difficult for me to actually say, because everybody's level of knowledge might be in a slightly different place. So, but what I would say to you to expect is that, in the future, is that at the beginning of every board meeting, we'll be holding some training sessions, and it might be during that quarter. There may be 1 or 2 events in a different format that may or may not be available to yourselves as committee, but we will track that and channel it through. Might be appropriate to some of you, not all of you, but what we will try and do is make sure that it is not as intrusive into your time that every waking moment is now taken up by pensions board and sit for knowledge and skills training, and you can't do the day job anymore.
Thank you, Matthew. That's helpful. Thank you.
Yes.
John Topping.
I was just going to say, I also welcome having this training sort of program and schedule in place. And I suppose my comment is that I was just, as you're going through, I was thinking that it's been a long time since as a pension board we've done any training. I was trying to think, I can't remember the last time actually we did do some. So I think it's important that we do get it back in and get it programmed back in. I literally can't remember the last time we did so. Maybe I may have missed some, but I suppose it is important that we do get it in, and it is regular. And I suppose this comes back to the frequency of the meetings. If we only have the meeting twice a year, then you're only giving yourself 2 opportunities per half an hour of training or 45 minutes. So I suppose that was my only comment, really, is that it does seem a long time ago. So I welcome the fact that we got this, but I suppose I wouldn't want us to be 2 years from now saying, well, actually, I can't remember the last time we did any training, because it would be a bit pointless. So that's probably sort of where I am. I know we did a lot when we first became board members, but I can't remember much since then, is an honest and there. So that was just a thought, really, rather than anything else.
Yeah. No, that's fine. And I think that maybe the first one that will be imminent, that will come through, is more likely towards the end of April, May time, I think, isn't it? Where we're holding an induction day for new members, which will form obviously the committee post the elections. And what we will be doing is inviting all the board members to come along, and that will be kind of maybe a slightly longer day in terms of the first induction, but might be useful for new board members as well, because we will go through the entire mechanics of, you know, the operations of the pension fund and focus on, you know, the actuarial side, the investment side, the governance side, and the frameworks and everything else that works through that. So there's something in the offing imminent already for you there, John.
Yeah, I think, Matthew, since you're new, I think what John was referring to is when we first started as a board, we did a number of joint sessions with the committee, training sessions specifically for Gloucestershire committee and board members. And like John, I don't remember when the last one of those was. A good couple of years ago, I would have thought. So whilst there's been training from Brunel and others, I don't think we've done anything Gloucestershire specific for some considerable period.
Yeah. No.
Can I just double check? Yeah. Can I just double check, Matthew? Did you say that the board members would be asked to complete a needs assessment?
We will be reaching out to the board members around, you know, their kind of training needs and aspects of it. So we'll be working again with Hymans in terms of that, you know, what once the strategy is being adopted. Okay, thank you.
I suppose it depends on how far short we fall on that as to how much training we might need to do, which might help answer Nigel's question as well as to how many hours we might need to spend on it. Any other questions on training strategy? Was this another one we were just noting for now, Matthew? I can't remember what the.
I think noting and endorsing the strategy, because obviously it does fundamentally apply to the board as well.
I think people are happy to endorse the strategy. I think I've had a couple of positive comments already in the debate. I think I can't see any no's. So I think, yeah, the board is happy to endorse the strategy.
Okay, thank you all.
Okay. Item 9 then, Matthew, is the business plan.
Yeah, the business plan for 2021. Sorry, yeah, 2021-22 on that side. Yeah, I think that's my cover report starts on page 149 of your packs there. The actual business plan for 21-22 is contained in Appendix 1, so it's a separate document to my cover report. My cover report looks back at the business plan for 2020-2021, looking at just as a slight output from there. Now, I bear in mind, obviously that business plan didn't go to committee until September, again due to cancelled meetings in the interim. So it was kind of approved and then live for 6 months on there. So what it showed really from the work plan as was, on pages 150 onwards, was an outturn of what was the agreed work plan from that last year's business plan. So there was a couple of areas where there are some crosses. The majority of them surround the governance, the policy statements and the governance and compliance statements. Now we've talked obviously about the funding strategy and the investment strategy statement that we have updated. Certainly the governance policy and others haven't been reviewed as part of that work plan, and I've deferred them into this work plan. Basically, for one of the main reasons is because we've got a commissioned Aon to actually undertake that governance review. Part of that review, which I'll talk about in shortly, will be to look and make sure that those statements and our governance structures are compliant. So I didn't really want to forerun that particular aspect of it. But there was obviously a need to adopt, certainly with the funding strategy statement, some of those discretions, otherwise the employers wouldn't have been able to utilise them. So I think from an outturn perspective, the majority of the work plan was approved, but the work plan predominantly was agenda items that were going to be going to committee, from previously on that side. The budget that was approved on page 153, again, what we've done is adapted that to reflect the budget that then goes and sits in the annual report. So I think last year's business plan and budget, it was a kind of 3 or 4 line item that brought everything together on the budget. What we've actually done, or what I've actually done here on the outturn and on the forecast outturn, is actually align it with the budget that sits in the annual report each year. And when we look at the priorities for next year, the budget for next year, we've replicated it in that way. So the board and the committee can actually then see and track it through as the year progresses, and then it will obviously reference exactly what then sits in the annual report from that side. I think looking forward, and I think so that's kind of the backward look of where we are on there. Looking forward at the priority areas that were agreed, there's obviously 4 main areas that we're going to look at through 2021-22. And that's the finalisation of the transition of the investment assets into the Brunel portfolios, of which from our perspective in Gloucestershire, there's only 2 left, which is the fixed interest, which should be happening in April, May of this year. We continue to adapt and implement the strategic asset allocation that we talked about before, and review the inflation risk, which is something that committee have agreed. The governance review is undertaken, and that governance review works about the interaction of the committee, the board, the constitution, and also the flow of information, as well as ensuring that all of our practices and procedures and policy statements are in line with best practice and regulation on that side. And then the last one, which was the progress of the recruitment plan. We talked about that before. Committee agreed additional resources, but actually bedding those resources in can take a while as you move through that recruitment. So those are really some of the key driver areas for us moving forward. Some of the things that we know are on the horizon that can deviate us from the action plan are things like McLeod, the 95k cap, the continued development of Brunel, and also just the impact of COVID on a number of things: funding, investment, and administration. Touch wood that we're on our roadmap now as we step out from that, but again, we just don't know what we don't know in terms of things moving forward from that side. So I think I will stop there. Obviously, the full business plan on page 21-22, for 21-22, which starts on page 157, is maybe more detailed in terms of a business plan. And when you certainly look through the work plan that we have, which starts on page 166 of your plaques, the intention will be is that will be brought back to committee and the board in some ways to track the level of activity ongoing throughout the year, so on a quarterly basis, to ensure that we're actually progressing that through. Now, one of the things that I do look at on some part is in terms of a work plan. I think one of the requests on the recommendation is that as part of the work plan moving forward, is that we actually now, off the back of this, actually then develop a work plan, or I come back with a draft work plan for the board to reflect certainly some of these activities that are going on at the fund level, to ensure the board are actually appropriately inputting into and oversighting certainly some of that activity moving forward. So I'll hand back to you, Sean.
Okay. Invite questions and comments from members of the board. Paul?
Again, I'd just like to commend Matthew on the report. I had a number of questions, but they're all answered in the report. So you know, I can only obviously compliment you on that fact.
Nigel, did you have your hand up? I couldn't quite work it out.
Yes, I did. No, again, really, as Paul, just thank you so much, Matthew. I mean, there's a huge amount of work gone into this, and we're going to present the board with a great deal of work in the future too. But nevertheless, we won't be blindsided by this because we've got a very clear direction of travel for what you're doing with your team. So echo Paul. Just thank you so much for this.
I suppose my question, Matthew, is: are there specific targets or measures of success associated with the plan? I mean, how will the committee know it's achieved it?
Yeah, I think that's certainly some of the areas that we will look to develop further. I think you know, from a success point, it will be what was intended to be delivered. Will it be delivered? Obviously, the administration strategy then contains specifics around targets in terms of turnaround times, which isn't captured in here because it's obviously captured within the administrative strategy. So you know, there are a number of reference documents that will bring this through. So. Yeah, I think obviously, you know, the auditing of the fund accounts, there is statutory deadlines that will apply to that. So ultimately, we will be kind of bringing this back to committee to make sure that, you know, we said that would be done in Q2. Has it been done in Q2? We could potentially be more specific on dates with certainly some of those items to make sure that it's achieved. So it depends what we're trying to measure and how we're trying to quantify that, Sean.
Okay. Any other questions for Matthew on the business plan? I think we're asked to note the business plan and the current outturn position on this year's plan. People are happy to note accordingly? Yes. Okay, thank you.
I think there was also just that final recommendation, if board would permit, that what I'd like to do is develop then a work plan for the board around that business plan to ensure that you're able to work accordingly and alongside that, and you kind of, I would recommend myself kind of going away, developing that and bringing that back to the next board meeting, if that would help, Chair.
Sorry, Matthew, I missed that one.
That's all right.
Yeah. I mean, this comes back to how do we as a board want to oversee the work of the committee in delivering this plan? So I think what you're suggesting, Matthew, is you bring back a specific plan to us about what information we'll be receiving when, which enables us to get that assurance.
Yes.
Is that what you're proposing?
That's what I'm proposing.
Which seems eminently sensible to me. I suppose any question would be about timescales. This again comes back to this issue. If we receive that in October, which will be halfway through the year, and we're unhappy with progress or unhappy with any element of it, and our next meeting is on the March 2022, it'd be rather a bit late to be influencing the business plan. So I think, you know, it does come back to this whole issue about how is this board undertaking its work. My own view is it may well be too late to have that report from you in October. Okay. I don't know if the board members have any. Yeah, Paul.
I guess this conversational subject matter has come up on pretty much every agenda item about the fact that this board meeting twice yearly is not adequate given the direction of travel. So I don't know when is the right time to sort of ask the question, but you know, I move that, you know, subject to whatever constitution and whatever resources are required, that we move to a quarterly meeting if that's permissible.
I would support that. I think a quarterly frequency would be probably enable us to get a much more up to the minute progress on this.
For information, the Oxfordshire board does meet quarterly. I think that there is, I think, in the good governance guidance, an expectation that boards do meet quarterly. So I think I don't know what the official way of getting this resolved, Andrea, is, but
yeah, what I'll do is I'll take this point away and I'll go and discuss with the head of democratic services, because obviously it impacts on DS resources as well. And then I'll have a conversation with Matthew and we'll circulate something to update the board in due course in email. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Yes.
And I think actually, I'm sure that Daniel and Karen are listening in. Will more than likely, as part of that governance review, it might well be, Andrea, that we will kind of, as part of the governance review, I'm sure they might have an insight into that aspect for us as well, which then might help from that perspective in terms of us moving forward on that side. Which I'm sure Daniel and Karen will talk about that shortly.
Of course. Thank you.
Yeah, I think in terms of your last recommendation, Matthew, about the work plan, I think we just need to add something in along the lines of on a timely manner. We need that work plan, but we need it in sufficient time that it's useful to us. And I think personally, I think October's too late.
Yeah. So just at the end of that recommendation, just put it within a timely manner. Yeah. If that's okay, Sean, we'll add that in.
Well, I can't vote, so I saw at least one nod from a board member. That it wasn't
Board members are happy with that one.
Yeah.
Okay.
I can now see more nods. Thank you. I'm assuming item 10, Andrew, is the exclusion of any press and public.
It is, Sean. If I can get you to read the text for agenda item 10, please. And then once you've read that, if we can just pause briefly after you've read that text, I'll then get Joe to stop the recording.
Is it on a page somewhere?
It's on the agenda.
Oh, on the agenda itself.
Yeah. Agenda item 10, so it goes over the 2 pages. Because we'll then need to get the board to take a vote on it.
That's in accordance with section 100A brackets 4 of the Local Government Act 1972. The public be excluded from the meeting for the following agenda items, because it is likely that if members of the public were present, there would be disclosure to them of exempt information as defined in paragraph 3 of part 1 of schedule 12A of the Act, and that the public interest in withholding information outweighs the public interest in disclosing the information to the public. Are people happy to accept that recommendation?
All in agreement? Thank you.